English translation, 616th contact Thursday, the 12th of March, 2015, 13:54 hours.
Ah, you are already reading the article I copied from the internet, which I wanted to show you, because I find interesting what is written about the German Chancellor Merkel. Although I added something about this woman to the 613th contact report on the 16th of February, I think that what you are reading might be worth knowing for many people who are interested in the content of the contact reports and do not have an internet connection.
Yes, after the corrections, I immediately went to your workroom, and there I found this excerpt on your desk, and thought that you might have put it down for me so that I could read it. If you do not mind, I would like to finish reading it.
Naturally.
Good. The whole thing should be really interesting for all those who are not familiar with this article. So you can.
Telephone rings.
Excuse me, according to the number, it is Eva. Well, then, we can move on to our conversation. You were just about to say something.
Right. And that is that it is certainly appropriate to attach the internet excerpt to our conversation, just at this point of my statement.
The Merkel regime, Zionist with IL pass, destroys Germany 2008 to 2014. The Zionist Jewish woman Angela Merkel gave Germany away as chancellor with a Jewish passport from 2008 to 2014. She is an agent. Film Protocol by Michael Palomino, 2014.
The Zionist Jew Angela Merkel gave Germany away from 2008 to 2014. She is destroying Germany. Zionist Merkel has an Israeli passport and gave Germany away from 2008 to 2014, strictly according to the Zionist program, to destroy the nation-states of Europe. To this end, the euro was created to make dependencies so bad that populations would accept a Brussels dictatorship and destroy themselves as a national identity. This is the meaning of the euro, described in Udo Ulfkotter's book, Bought Journalists, in Chapter 5. Ms. is, until 2012, it was hardly known that Ms. This is shown in the following video. To be Jewish is normal, but to be a Zionist and to hang out with the high Zionists in Jerusalem and to pursue a Zionist policy in Germany against Germans is really going too far. Mrs. You cannot do that. I am sure she'd be better off as head of government in Jerusalem. The following video shows the attitude of Chancellor Merkel. She is demonstrably Jewish, but unfortunately also a Zionist with a Zionist order of the secret lodge B'nai B'rith. And Mrs. and Ms. This too can no longer be accepted by the German population. It needs a change.
I do not think we have to discuss that because I think you see it all in such a way that it is just information about what can be found on the internet about this Mrs.
Exactly, because I see no reason why we should express our opinion and not have to discuss it. It should only be information about what is written about the federal chancellor on the internet, and to what extent the whole corresponds to correctness. We really do not have to decide about that.
It would be absurd to do so.
Exactly. There is another question that has arisen about what you said on the 23rd of February 2015 at the 614th official contact conversation in connection with National Group Assistance, Study Groups and Interest Group Assistance.
Then what Florina told me, according to your explanations, is to say that, of course, every study group in a country has to be assigned to the respective national group. Even if in a study group a core group member is assigned as a direct core group contact person. However, the regular contact and liaison point for each study group is the corresponding national group, but not the core group. The core group contact person for study groups and national groups merely acts as a silent observer, without having to intervene directly in the ordinary agenda of meetings. This is prohibited because each study or country grouping has and must carry out its business or agenda according to its own correct guidelines, without the core group contact person interfering in it. The core group contact person is only required to answer questions if he or she is addressed directly by the chairperson of the group during agenda items, etc., and if he or she is invited to speak and answer. If this is not the case, the core group contact person only has to act as a silent observer. If this is not observed by a core group contact person, then this person must immediately be released from its observer obligation and replaced by another core group member acting correctly. This is to be maintained in the study groups as well as in the national groups. And if it turns out that an interest group, which is the only one to report to the core group, etc., is an observer grouped by a core group member, then the same rules apply to this grouping as well. A core group contact person as an associate of interest groups. Study groups and national groups only has the right to speak in special cases at their agenda meetings if he or she is explicitly entrusted by the core group in the parent center with a special task which he or she has to perform on behalf of the core group. If this is not the case, the core group contact person has no right whatsoever to interfere in the agenda, etc., of the relevant interest group, study group, or national group, unless he or she is requested by the respective chairperson of the relevant group to make a statement and to speak and answer. Each FIGU group is acting independently. In every respect, therefore, an observer has no right to interfere in its affairs of any kind unless requested to do so by the chairperson of the respective group, as has already been said. Should difficulties and ambiguities, etc., arise in one of the FIGU groupings, then it is not the task of the observer to deal with these, but rather the responsibility of the chairperson or, if necessary, the executive committee, whereby under certain circumstances the chairperson or the group executive committee can ask the core group observer to speak and answer, as must be said another time. If a matter cannot be clarified in this way, it must be delegated directly to the core group in the mother center. This meant that, as a result of the first sentence, the regular contact and liaison office for each study group is, however, the corresponding national group, but not the core group. Now, it is not clear whether this also applies if something appears in a study group that cannot be clarified by the chairperson or the board, or if it should then be directly transferred to the core group. According to the last sentence with which you said the following, if something cannot be clarified in this way, then it must be delegated directly to the core group in the mother center. The first sentence clearly states that the regular contact and liaison office for each study group is always the corresponding national group. If a study group cannot clarify a matter by the chairman or the executive committee or under circumstances, together with a core group assessor person, if this is requested by the executive committee or the chairperson for speech and answer, then the next instance is to be addressed, which is in each case the national group. How clearly with the first sentence is clarified and cannot be interpreted and understood differently than in this way. It is not clear to me why this is not understood, because my last explanation does not contradict what has been stated regarding the respective national group, to which the study groups have to be assigned.
For me, this was logical, because that is how I understood and explained it, in the way that your sentence, if a matter cannot be clarified in this way, then it must be delegated directly to the core group in the parent center, refers solely to the national group, which is responsible for a study group, as the core group is the contact person for a national group. But this was clarified a long time before you gave the instruction regarding the assessors on the 23rd of February.
I cannot understand why the whole thing is not understood.
It is Earth-human logic.
More like illogical, Edward.
That's what I mean, but let's not do that, because now nothing should be misunderstood anymore. So something else. We talked about it some time ago, and also made a probability calculation that voices would soon be raised in the EU dictatorship. that a European Union army would be set up, which I recently also passed on to the group. Now I wanted to look in the interview reports, what and when you and I talked about it, but I could not find anything concerning this conversation. Can you remember when that was so I can pick it out? This is precisely because it was now reported in the newspapers and television news that this desire was actually demanded, namely by the EU Dictatorship Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker and the German Federal Defense Minister Ursula von der Leyen. Spiegel has online messages on the internet for this purpose.
The Ukrainian crisis brings Europe to the brink of war. Is NATO sufficient to deal with such conflicts? Or do we need a European army?
With his statements, Juncker strengthens a position of Federal Defense Minister Ursula von der Leyen. She also promotes the future vision of a European army. The CDU politician stressed in February, however, that the idea could not be reached in the short term. But just as she is convinced that perhaps not my children, but then my grandchildren will have the United States of Europe, she is convinced of the goal of the European armed forces. In addition to these notes, there are several others that deal with the matter, but which I do not want to copy from the internet, because that of Spiegel Online Messages is enough to confirm what we two spoke and predicted together some time ago. When I came into conversation with Bernadette about this, because there was talk in newspapers of a European army, I thought that you and I had only recently talked about it. In the meantime, however, it dawned on me that it must have been some time ago, perhaps a year or two.
14. I can remember that. Wait. Yes, here. It was already in 2010, on the 22nd of March, after our official part of the 491st conversation, which we continued privately. Therefore, this part is not included in the conversation report. Among other things, we talked together about the probabilities of future world events. And in a number of relations, we also made calculations of possibilities, also with regard to how the European Union would shape itself in the future. Together, we arrived at the result that sooner or later the EU would set up a European army. And indeed, the time is now given when our probability calculations begin to come true. It was really only a matter of time.
Exactly, yes. Now I remember again that we compared the EU dictatorship with the beginnings of the Nazi dictatorship. You then also recalled from your notes what your father Psychopath told me about Adolf Hitler when he showed me various destroyed cities in Germany that had been destroyed by the Americans through bombs or in other European countries by the Nazi troops. As a little boy, the whole thing had brought me to my knees and into my world of thoughts and feelings, so that I could not forget it to this day. I can still hear your father's voice in my memory today, when he told me that Hitler was a liar, a criminal of humanity, a psychopath and a perfect actor, who also suffered from megalomania, which he dictatorially implemented from the very beginning of his power through his degenerated destructive instinct, no matter that he had to go over millions of corpses and tremendous destruction. Furthermore, Psychopath said, Hitler was extremely cowardly and shot himself out of life when the time came for him to face accountability. That by this he meant Hitler's suicide. I actually understood that, but only realized it later, when he actually shot himself. I remember that your father also said that Hitler had fallen prey to a degenerated mania of annihilation and destruction that had arisen in him at the beginning of his puberty, between the ages of 10 and 12. The reason for this was because his father mistreated him and physically maltreated him, but also demolished him psychologically. His mother was also to blame, for she had been mentally ill and had therefore raised Adolf Hitler wrongly from her side. Hitler simply let himself go, and he did not try to get a good education for himself, said Psychopath, because he had truly alienated himself from his parents. And with regard to all the things that had an effect on him, he had never sought blame on himself, but always only on others. So, your father said, Adolf Hitler saw himself in his childhood and youth as a victim of others and his environment, by which he also apologized for his constant failure, but swore that he would take revenge on all the human beings if he ever gained power. As a psychopath, Hitler, on the other hand, contrary to the fact that he constantly saw himself as the victim of others, was fully aware that through his suggestive speeches he could seduce his fellow men and bring them to his side, which he also used abundantly to gain advantages and power over others, which ultimately led to him establishing the Nazi system in Germany and being elevated to the status of leader. Truthfully, Hitler also had a death instinct, as Spath said, which not only related to himself, but also resulted in the death mania of countless other people and the boundless destructive rage. And by this far-reaching madness he could also instill hatred into the German people and all those people who have attached hatred to him and his fanatical and radical speeches, who spoke after his madness and put everything into action in the worst way possible. He was as suggestive in his speeches as many other people are who suggestively rake their fellow men with fanatical and radical utterances, allegations, lies, speeches, and slander, and make them commit murders, develop hatred against whole groups and peoples as well as races, religions, and sects. And all those people who listen to such fanaticism and radicalism as well as hatred, murder, revenge, and retaliation preaching creatures and accept everything what is said to them and also do what is demanded of them are in their thoughts and feelings as well as in their views. Opinions and attitudes towards reality and its truth foreign, and therefore unrealistic. And this attitude of people towards reality and its truth clearly shows that they are coldly indifferent to everything and everyone, except when it is maliciously selfish about their own welfare and benefits. The fact is that these people do not think especially for their fellow human beings, but only for themselves, so they let others think for themselves in all other relationships and things. Just will-less and influenceable by suggestive speeches, assertions, lies, and slander of creatures who know about their suggestive power and thereby drive people into misery and distress. And it has to be said that these very suggestive people are usually, and without exception, powermongers who beguile their listeners and drive them to things. Actions and deeds that are against every humanity and against every human honor and dignity. And if they have found victims among their listeners, then it is also these who immediately and without loss of time harass and rake others, insult them, and possibly even assault them. And this only because they are driven to do so by suggestive incitement, and do not think for themselves, but simply indifferently accept everything that others suggestively chew on for them. But back to what I was actually talking about, what your father Spath told me when he flew me around in his beam ship in the destroyed Europe and showed me things that had effectively run into my bones. I remember everything very well when, as a little boy in his pear-shaped beam ship, he took me to various European countries and let me see the immense horrors of war, which burned themselves into me as evil memories and showed me what the people of Earth are capable of. Everything was very shattering, especially the great misery and the many hardships of the people I could observe from the beam ship, as well as the respective explanations of Spath, which he gave me again and again, whereby everything led me to build up my life attitude, as I have received it until today. Through all my observations in this regard, I learned real compassion for my fellow human beings, as well as honest love for everything and everything that has life in it. The dignity of man also became a great concept to me, just as protection in relation to every human life and every creature became a necessity to me. Also, the immeasurable value of every human life and every creature was indelibly imprinted in me, as well as the great value of peace, freedom, and harmony. But I also got to know many other great values for myself and my life through the flights that Spath made possible for me all over Europe, where everywhere there were immense destructions. The whole thing impressively shaped my life and showed me the way I had to go. Everything was a very valuable life lesson for me, for which I am infinitely grateful to Spath. Without your father Spath, it would not have been possible for me, as a young boy, to see all that I could see and experience with his help. But all these things are not recorded in an official contact conversation report, as you say, because we discussed them in a private way.
That was indeed the case. But it was not so easy for my father to make the decision. Because you were still very young, so he first had to clarify whether you could cope with the whole thing, which was the case after all, as it turned out.
I did not know that because Svoth did not say anything like that back then, not even with a little remark, if I remember correctly. But obviously at that time he was right about my perceptive and behavioral skills and my ability to process these things. But man, oh man, how quickly time passes. Then it is already 5 years since we made the probability calculations and had our extensive conversation. And now the time has come to officially raise the issue of a European Union army or an EU dictatorship army. I think that the Ukrainian crisis, which the irrationality of the EU power holders, especially the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, had brought to the fore can now, under certain circumstances, actually lead to a war between Europe and Russia. And the whole thing is now being put on top of this by the USA marching troops into the NATO states bordering on Russia in order to carry out military maneuvers over a longer period of time. The truth of which, however, is of a completely different nature. For Russia, the whole thing is a serious military provocation, which will continue to fuel disaster and may ultimately result in a vicious war out of everything. And as I see the whole thing, behind everything there is the German Chancellor Angela Merkel as the ringleader, who suggestively influences all those in power in her sphere of influence, like Adolf Hitler once did, and leads a riot against Russia, also in the USA, which can lead to a very bad end. All those influenced by Merkel, however, are so stupid that they do not realize what she is up to and what is really going on. What can arise out of it, and how this woman is leading all the stupid and her inferiors by the nose, so that she can realize her insidious plans. And because of what the EU dictatorship and Merkel are stirring up with their machinations against Russia, the former Chancellor Helmut Schmidt also has his say on this. Namely, he says the following on the internet in Contra Magazine, which I copied out here.
Ukraine crisis. Helmut Schmidt fears a hot war with Russia in politics. Politics DACH.
Former Chancellor Helmut Schmidt warns of a hot war with Russia. The member of the Atlantic Bridge argued that the West must have more understanding for Russian politics. But in German politics, other forces have the say. By Marco Meier. In contrast to the Bild, former Chancellor Helmut Schmidt once again showed himself to be an ex-politician who, despite his membership of the Atlantic Bridge, has a certain understanding of the situation in Russia. He points out that the West must change its policy on Russia, otherwise it is not completely ruled out that the conflict over Ukraine will even become a hot war. In Schmidt's view, Putin's great concerns did not apply to countries such as Ukraine, Poland, or the Baltic states, but rather to countries such as China, Pakistan, and the Central Asian former Soviet republics. Russia was surprised by the EU's decisions on enlargement to the east in the early 1990s during a Wild West period under the then-President Boris Yeltsin. This is taking its toll today, Schmidt said, because Yeltsin's successor Putin had once again brought Russia international attention. We do not have to like Putin's politics, but we must understand them from history and take them seriously. It turns out that some German ex-politicians in old age attained the reason that they missed in their active time, probably for political reasons regarding the occupation statute. This ingratiation with U.S. policy, which is still taking place today, prevents an independent political line. This is precisely why the danger of war is greater today than it has been for a very long time. Helmut Schmidt has recognized this.
And if an EU dictatorship army or a European Union army is formed, as demanded by Juncker and von der Leyen, which of course Chancellor Merkel also supports, as was reported on television the day before yesterday on the reading bars, then every hope for an international or a European Union army following the Henok pattern will disappear once again. Multinational peace struggle force, through which all wars and terrorism etc. on Earth could be ended sooner or later, and real-world peace could be created. But apparently it is the same as it has been since time immemorial that the power-hungry in the governments, especially those of the EU dictatorship, want to build their own army instead of taking the necessary steps to strive for and form a multinational peace struggle force, or to build up a multinational peace struggle army in order to finally put an end to all war and terror hotspots on Earth with their intervention and power. Power should be taken out of the hands of all power-hungry in those governments and handed over to the people who act undemocratically and far from any popular will, as is the case in Europe in the EU dictatorship as well as in many other countries of the world. Power should at least be handed over to that part of the people who is trying to live in peace, freedom, and harmony, and in complete democracy. The power-hungry of all governments simply have no power in their hands. But as long as these power-hungry people have the say in governments with regard to political state and world affairs, so long will there be discord, lack of freedom and disharmony, and thus wars and terrorism in the world. This also applies equally to religions and their sects, for as long as these still exist and believers do not strive to turn to the creational natural laws and recommendations in order to live, think and act according to them, as long as there is religious and sectarian fanatism and radicalism, as well as murderer militias resulting from it, such as the IS and its sects, Islamist State in Iraq and Syria, the Taliban in Afghanistan, the Al-Qaeda, which is widespread in many countries, as well as the Boko Haram in Nigeria, etc., etc., as well as the pure and worldwide spread criminal organizations.
What you say is correct. And with regard to state power, it must be said that it does not belong in the hands of one or more power-obsessed rulers, but in the hands of the predominantly democratic and thus also peaceful and liberal-thinking people. And the fact is that, since politics and religions have existed on Earth, as well as sects that are both religious and other, political, religious, and sectarian aberrations have led to murders, wars, and terrorism as a result of the fanaticization and radicalization of political, religious, and sect believers. So, as long as false policies, religions, and sects of all kinds continue to exist on Earth, wars, terrorism, murders, destruction, and many inhuman degenerations of malicious human behavior will result.
But state structures such as republics and monarchies as well as dictatorships know no democracy at all, because in such countries it is only a lie that democracy prevails even though none exists. Effectively, the whole world, and thus the entire earthly population of all states, should take an example from Switzerland, which is really very largely democratic. This is the case when certain influences are ignored by parties that exercise a certain dictating severity on individual parts of their party members, which is especially the case with those who do not think and decide for themselves, but let the party leaders, etc., think for themselves. On the whole, however, it can be said that in Switzerland the people generally have the say, and that there are only a few exceptions. Unfortunately, however, there are also people in Switzerland who are undemocratic, and therefore want to subordinate themselves to the EU dictatorship, and thereby betray their democratic homeland. Our forefathers would probably turn around in their graves if they were aware of this treachery of home of these pro-EU dictatorship criers, because they could not understand that they have sacrificed their expensive blood and lives completely uselessly in heavy fights against bailiffs and invaders, in order to make Switzerland free from foreign and dictatorial rule.
I do not think I need to comment on that.
I do not expect either. But in answer to my following question, again and again, nature films and animal films are shown on television, in which elephants play a role in such a way that, in contrast to other animals, they linger with cadavers or bones of deceased conspecifics and touch them with their trunks and somehow examine them, it seems to me. Elephants are mammals with a very sensitive disposition, which is why I think that they perceive the fine fluid vibrations of the cadavers and bones of the deceased, members of the same species, and somehow say goodbye by their behavior to the dead of their same species. What do you think of my assumption?
I know the phenomenon you are describing, and we have done a lot of research on it, and we have come to the conclusion, as you have briefly explained, that this is exactly the case.
I thought so, so I guessed right. because something else would not have made sense to me. It results indeed also with other animals and other creatures, etc., as I could observe again and again that they sniff at their dead conspecifics. They poke, look at, and somehow mourn them. But in the frame, how the elephants behave in this regard, the whole was always completely different. Also other mammals and all animals, as well as reptiles, fish and birds, etc., have a kind of emotions, which are more instinctive or with certain mammals partly even low-minded nature. Therefore, it is understandable for me that they also perceive the death of their conspecifics and mourn them in some instinctive or even low-minded form. In any case, I have often noticed this during my life in the wild, when I have seen dead creatures and observed that they were somehow mourned by conspecifics. It is clear to me that all animals in all forms of life have some form of psyche, be it instinctive, low-minded, or impulsive. This means that they can all have some form of grief, joy, and depression, as well as psychological problems and anxiety, so they can all feel pain or death when they are threatened. Many of these creatures also have attachment, and I even want to say that in certain mammals I could even perceive something like a laugh in special situations. This may seem crazy to the people of Earth, but I think it is incomprehensible and crazy to them only because they are not used to perceiving reality with open senses and to seeing and hearing what can be seen and heard effectively. Of course, here and there, illusions of sight and hearing can occur. But if the senses of reality are pronounced and consciously cultivated, then such illusions can be either largely or completely eliminated.
What you say is undoubtedly what you say in every way. People walk blind and deaf in spite of their eyes and ears, so they only unconsciously perceive many things in the great outdoors and do not really see and hear reality. But this leads to the fact that many things are not realized and not understood by the senses, so that there can be no understanding of what is unconsciously perceived visually and audibly. Visual perception is the recording and processing of visual stimuli, in which relevant information is extracted from the eye and brain, such as the recognition of elements, which are then interpreted by comparison with memories. From this point of view, the visual perception goes far beyond the mere absorption of information, so that things can be seen as they are in their effectiveness. As in your case, for example, when in a psychological test, you only defined ink blotches as ink blotches, and therefore only saw and judged what was given. In relation to hearing, the quality of hearing determines the way of registering or acoustically perceiving what is heard. If the quality of the hearing is healthy in a good way and unaffected by any damage, then something that has been heard can be clearly and unambiguously perceived. Correctly judged in terms of consciousness, thoughts, and feelings, processed, and also an effectively correct sound judgment can be formed. The visual and acoustic abilities, as well as the visual and hearing abilities, can to a large extent be practiced or trained by humans, so it is up to them to judge what they have seen or heard correctly.
But the majority of the Earthlings are also alien to reality, which is not only related to hearing and seeing as well as to nature and its fauna and flora, but also to the effective reality and its truth, as well as to the reality in relation to politics, religions, and sects, as well as the world economy and the old, present, and future everyday events, situations, and world affairs in general. It ignores all reality and truth, which is also proved by all the prophecies that have been brought, but also by my predictions, which I already made in the 1950s and also in the following years in connection with true migrations of peoples as a result of the refugee system. Already at that time I predicted the streams of refugees which had been taking place for years, which would result from political, warlike, and economic turmoil, or from reasons of persecution, etc., as has already been demonstrated for decades by all the masses of refugees who were coming to Europe from many countries. And these streams of refugees come from Tibet, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and India, from various African and Arab states, or from anywhere else on Earth, and over people, the longer the more the whole of Europe.
This is indeed the case, and it would probably be of value that a detailed and open word is spoken about the fulfillment of these predictions in a bulletin. perhaps by Occam Wolf, since he deals again and again in bulletin articles with the fulfillment of prophecies and predictions, which is why I think he would be the right person for such an article.
It's to do the asking, though I think Bernadette, she's in contact with him via email, can approach him and ask if he's willing to write such an article for a bulletin.
Which would be really desirable.
So I will inform Bernadette when I talk to her and think about your desire.
Thank you, because I think that a bulletin should contain clear facts about this.
I am sure there is nothing wrong with that. But now I have a question about the books, articles, and writings that you have from my pen and that you translate into your languages. So I've been interested for a long time in how you use them to make them accessible to your people.
We have talked about this before, but I can go into it again. All right, everything will be translated into our languages, both the languages of individual peoples and our world language. The translations are then used to produce books which are distributed to interested parties and are therefore very widely distributed.
I know that, but what material are the books made of?
The material you would call paper-like, but it is artificially made of electrons which are present in immeasurable mass throughout the material part of the universe.
Another question, which is probably a bit stupid, because you once said that we should not make electronic books, because they would not do any good for effective learning. Nevertheless, the question is, do you also not produce electronic books yourselves?
No, because they are completely unsuitable for learning, because the material which is read in such works is only superficially absorbed and does not really stick extensively in the memory, which is completely different in works which can be read and studied in writing and word directly before the eyes of materials, just like books, etc., and can be studied again in multiple repetitions. Only the real optical view based on solid material is suitable for a real study, while electronic books or other elements of any electronic kind are not suitable for an effective study, because only a deficient learning comes about by these, and usually the read cannot be registered effectively in the memory. This has to do on the one hand with the inattentiveness of the reading person, and on the other hand with the fact that the electronic or electromagnetic oscillations impair the thought-feeling memory, which has the consequence that something which is read electronically is always registered incompletely in terms of memory. The effect of this is that the same electronically read material or written work does not remain completely in the memory, but must be retrieved again and again or read and repeated again.
This is a clear explanation why correct, but not electronic books should be read and studied. And what you said probably applies to everything in electronic form when it comes to learning and studying something. It is probably also to be considered that with real books and their reading and studying this happens in peace and somehow harmoniously, while with electronic books somehow hecticness, restlessness, and inattentiveness come to light, as I myself have noticed on various occasions when electronically written things were shown to me.
That is true, but those people who deal with articles, books, writings, or similar things in an electronic way are not able to perceive this and therefore neither to realize nor to understand it, because they are biased by electronics and surrender to their own unreal reality. In this way, so to speak, a world of its own is created in which man lives, is imprisoned, and on which he is addicted and thus dependent.
It can be said that a person becomes a freak very quickly in this way. That is to say, someone who is excessively enthusiastic about electronic things, for example, e-books, mobile phones, iPads and apps, etc., but the whole thing behaves differently. I think when it comes to electronic records which, for example, point out certain facts and simply clarify things which can be quickly registered by memory and quickly grasped by intellect.
What you said is correct.
Well, then this question. Gerhard Schroeder was German Chancellor before he was sawed off as such, after which Angela Merkel took the helm and since then has been pursuing a policy that is driving Russia into a nasty situation which, in the worst case, can lead to a major military fire, as former Chancellor Helmut Schmidt also says. If I now think of the fact that in Iraq the murderer organization Islamic State, which is still called trivializing Islamic State instead of Islamist, could not have come into being if the USA had not invaded the country with war, death and destruction, and had not executed Saddam Hussein because he had already nipped in the bud the emergence of this murderer militia in the bud. Then I see the same thing with the war-agitating machinations of Merkel. This is precisely because, if this had not taken over, but Gerhard Schroeder had remained Chancellor, the whole thing would not have surrendered and would not continue to surrender. What Merkel has done and continues to do against Russia and also against Germany as a threat to peace. And with all her fuss, everything has not remained with Russia and Germany. Because since this woman has also been able to speak her mind in the EU dictatorship, this dictatorship has also been extensively involved in the whole threat of disaster and ruin.
Which is undoubtedly the case. But now, Edouard, I have to go my way again, but if you need me, you can call me if you ask Florina or Anjana to do it. Goodbye, dear friend.
Sure, then goodbye, Ptah, my friend. Farewell to you also, and then therefore until your next visit.